Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this woodland stream. I'm hoping that this beginner-friendly demo will be of interest to beginners and intermediates alike. The first thing I did, as always, was just to roughly sketch out a scene. This is kind of from my imagination, but what I did is I looked at lots of similar photographs on Pixabay and then made up my own. So I've got a sort of a winding stream with some rocks running into it and some trees outlined in the background. I'm going to start off by using the wet in wet method and trying to centre the light in the middle so I have a gap between the trees, and that light should then shine onto the stream. I'm just wetting in the middle and then drying off with a tissue because I don't want the actual stream itself to be wet. So just wetting the area behind the back of the stream and then coming in and putting a little bit of water with my large wash brush into the sides. This is a size 18 synthetic round brush or mop brush, and I'm dabbing some lemon yellow into the wet background around where I want my little clearing. Lemon yellow is quite a cold colour, so I'm warming it up with some cad yellow in places, and hopefully that will give me the look of sunlight catching the leaves. This is my sky colour, which is a nice light value of cobalt blue. I'm just sort of fitting it between those lovely yellow areas. I've now mixed some green. This is sap green, and I'm running that sap green into the yellows so it'll softly diffuse and wet blend on the page. I'm using my 1.5 inch Princeton Aqua Elite modeler for this. I really like it as a wash brush, and it's great for getting these really loose brush strokes on where we can suggest the trees in the background rather than overtly painting them. I've added some burnt sienna to make that green really earthy and darker valued. Changing it up, dipping into the sap green, the brighter colours, the darker colours, and that's a little bit of Payne's grey for some deep shadow. And then using varying amounts of the same colours, I'll continue to work, bringing the riverbank forward, starting off suggestions of the winding shape of the river or stream, and then I'll do the same sort of thing to begin to build up the other side. I'm now using a rigger brush while everything's still damp and pulling in some fine brush strokes, going over my pencil lines or roughly near them, creating some trees and branches that should soften back into the damp wash a bit. Giving the impression of a few in the far distance and more of these branches in the middle ground. Hopefully that will give me a sense of depth and distance. And then scraping through the damp paint with my palette knife, which scratches through the damp paint to reveal the paper underneath, and that gives me some variety to the tones and the colours of my trees. And then I can use my palette knife to create a few little highlights, scraping back some of the paint across the top of the mossy rocks that are tumbling into the stream bed. This is a loose painting, so everything that I'm doing is hopefully just to suggest this detail rather than overtly painting it. I'm now just going to use my fan brush, almost dry, just with a tiny bit of sap green on it, and just scumble some paint across the tree trunks and branches in a few places, just sort of roughing up those areas, giving them a bit more texture, a little bit more suggestions of leaf canopies. And then I want to just add a bit more texture to the foreground just before I let it dry. So I'm going to protect the sky in the distance with a piece of scrap paper and then flick some water drops with my fingers into the rich paint in the foreground, where there are those mossy rocks and the sides of the sort of stream bank. And hopefully that will give me some lovely texture as the water runs into the paint, maybe a few little blossoms and blooms and interesting textures. Hopefully you can sort of see that now that I've zoomed in. You can see that it's beginning to give me sort of suggested detail without me overtly having to paint it. I now need to leave it to dry completely. And while I wait for it to dry, I'll just tell you about my new book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner, which is now available to order from all good online bookstores in the UK and available to pre-order for an early July release elsewhere, as far as I know. So getting back to the painting, here is the dry first layer. I'm pretty happy with the distant trees and the riverbanks or stream banks. I just need to bring together a little bit of detail and to suggest the moving water in the stream. I've mixed up some cobalt blue with a little bit of burnt sienna to get a really nice pale grey. You can see I'm using the tips of the flat brush and just running this grey colour, very pale, in the stream in horizontal brush strokes in the background. I'm leaving plenty of unpainted paper. This will hopefully suggest white water as the stream tumbles down over the rocks. I can darken up my grey slightly, intensify the colour by adding a dash more cobalt blue and a dash more burnt sienna, and just bring that darker grey into the middle ground. And this will help to give me some aerial perspective with the paler grey in the distance. And as I come forward, I'm trying to be mindful not to fill in all of the unpainted paper, using some dry brush effects here and there by sort of skimming the brush over the paper, softening back if there's anything that looks a little bit too harsh, and adding more blue into the grey in the foreground, just to intensify the colour and darken the value slightly, working around between the rocks and the stream banks. It's important when painting the water to keep the brushstrokes mostly horizontal, and that means that the water stays flat, if you see what I mean, across from one side of the stream to the other. I can add in a bit more Payne's grey and darken up the riverbank in places. Try not to overdo it, but just enough to bring the detail together. And now for some darker tree trunks, working around the marks that I painted in wet and the marks that I scraped through the damp paint. Again, using the rigger brush. This time, because I'm working with wet paint onto a dry painting, my marks stay put where they are. I'm trying to make sure that I keep my marks nice and faint, just so that I'm suggesting the trees. Maybe bed them into the ground a little bit with just a few scribbly marks at the base. Trying not to be too precious about where I put the brush strokes, but just sort of creating a little bit of a tangle of branches, but hopefully without overworking it too much. Moving on and doing the same over to this side, making sure that I try to keep this side looking slightly different from the other side, so that we've got a sort of natural sense of asymmetry, if you see what I mean. Maybe knocking any paint back by dabbing it with a tissue if it's a little bit dark. And then just taking my grey mixture and darkening up parts of the water in the foreground, and then bringing that grey between the outcroppings of the stream bank here and there, just to bring the painting together. Something and nothing, really. In fact, the whole painting here is something and nothing. So let's remove the tape and have a look and see how it looks. See if we've achieved the illusion that we were looking to try to get of this woodland stream, painted very loosely. Once we remove the tape, we can see the painting looking a little bit more finished. And it's interesting how it gives us a chance to see it with fresh eyes. And I've noticed that there's a gap that I'm not keen on between the trees over here on the left. So I'm going to add in a few more branches and trunks, not too much, but just enough to kind of bridge that gap and to make it feel more balanced. And then I can just add a few little touches of paint here and there, just a few finishing touches, anywhere where I think it might benefit just from sort of a little stick or a twig or something like that. Just a few random brush strokes, just adding a bit of interest. And I think I'm quite happy to leave the painting there. I think it has done what I wanted it to. I've got this lovely loose painting that suggests the scene rather than any overtly painted fussy detail. It's just a lot of beautiful loose brush strokes that come together to create the scene that we want. And if you look closely, you can see the brushwork a bit more clearly. And it's basically consists of me considering the directionality of my brushwork. In other words, horizontal for the water and for the riverbanks with maybe a slight lean, and then the more random brushwork for the trees in the middle ground and the background, but more importantly centering the light in the middle and keeping the light and plenty of unpainted paper in the stream itself. I hope you found that helpful. If you enjoyed the video, then please give us a thumbs up, and if you aren't already subscribed to our channel, then maybe you'd consider subscribing. It really helps with our reach and it's completely free to do. And many thanks, of course, as always, to our wonderful patrons on Patreon who support us and the channel. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.